don't want to discourage you from being in this room, but there is another class going at this time. There's an alternative class in the fellowship hall with John Cassidy teaching purpose. So he didn't have much of a crowd last week. I don't think we made it clear that there was a second class going. So I wanted to be sure and announce that this morning. Let's begin this morning's discussion with a song. If the skies above you are gray, you are feeling so blue. If your cares and burdens seem great all the whole day through, there's a silver lining that shines in that heavenly land. Look by faith and see it, my friend. Trust in his promises grand. Sing and be happy, press on to the goal. Trust him who leads you, he will keep your soul at all. Be faithful, look to him and pray. Lift your voice and praise him in song. Sing and be happy today. That's not what we're going to talk about at all. We're not here to talk about happiness. Instead, we've never been commanded to be happy unless someone has mistranslated that term, in my opinion. Instead, Paul wrote in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 4, rejoice in the Lord always, and again I will say rejoice. That's a command. Now I can command joy, but I cannot command happiness, because happiness depends on circumstance. The word hap is the Old English word for chance. We even put it together as happenstance somewhere. Good circumstances, or the way that chance has worked out. Happiness has to do with circumstances and surroundings and what's going on in our life. We just happen to have a good day. But Paul commanded joy, and we'll conclude the section with I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me. And that includes having joy while chained to a Roman soldier. That deserves some looking into. We desperately need joy. Do you remember Grandpa Jones and Chet Atkins' song with his buddies? You could probably sing it along with me, couldn't you? Gloom, despair, and agony on me. Oh, deep, dark depression, excessive misery. If it weren't for bad luck, I'd have no luck at all. Gloom, despair, and agony on me. And I love that bass that would come in on me. You know, that they were so miserable, it was funny, but it's not very funny. We are living among people who are miserable. We are less and less happy, it seems like, these days. This week we're going to talk about the misery that we're all in, how desperately we need the Philippians chapter 4, beginning in verse 4 and going through verse 13. We're going to talk about how desperately that's needed this week, and then next week we will finish introducing this idea of joy in the Lord with an overview of the entire book of Philippians, emphasizing how many times Paul writes about joy in this little book of 4 chapters. How many times he's rejoicing, even if he himself is in prison, even if he's opposed by others who are supposed to be preaching the gospel. No matter what's going on in his life, the Apostle Paul commands, and he has found the secret for joy. So I think this is worth studying, because I need more joy. Benjamin Franklin was one of the most identifiable people in the American Revolution. You knew him when he walked down the street. In fact, he was an international figure. The whole world was reading about his experiments with the kite. And he'd become one of the richest men in America by having half of the postal deliveries in America were his responsibility through a company he had formed, and he had bid for and gotten the right to do so. And he was either the first or the second richest person in the colonies, the first or second otherwise would have been Martha Washington. Two of the most wealthy people, you knew exactly who they were, but after the revolution was won and before the Constitution came in and put us on a solid footing for a government and gave us the ability to start paying back our Revolutionary War debts, the American economy was in free fall. In fact, there was a statement, a saying that went around, a little proverb, as worthless as a continental. And they were talking about the continental dollar. Nothing was more worthless than the continental dollar. Someone is said to have crossed the street and grabbed Benjamin Franklin by the lapels during this period of terrible financial hardship and instability and accosted him and said, "Where is all that happiness you promised us?" And Franklin is famously said to have replied, "All that is promised, my friend, is the pursuit of happiness. You're going to have to catch up to it for yourself. And we better start working at it if we're going to catch up to happiness." It does take effort. There is a formula, if you will, in Scripture to explain to us how to have joy, because joy is a choice. Research tells us people aren't very happy. Research tells us that we're becoming more and more miserable. I'll give you the source for this as we finish, but let me bring you this fairly lengthy quote. "Life in America keeps getting more miserable according to the latest data from the General Social Survey, one of the longest running and most highly regarded public opinion research projects in the nation. On a scale of 1 to 3, where 1 represents not too happy and 3 means very happy, Americans on average gave themselves a 2.18, just a hair above pretty happy. That's a significant decline from the nation's peak happiness as measured by the survey of the early 1990s. They say the change is driven by the number of people who say they're not too happy. 13% in 2018 compared with 8% in 1990. That's more than a 50% increase in unhappy people. Other recent research confirms this trend. The latest World Happiness Report, released this week, finds that a separate measure of overall life satisfaction fell by 6% between 2007 and 2018. I know the Great Recession fell in that period of time, 2008. But by 2018, we had one of our greatest periods of economic expansion we've ever known. Only World War II really outshone it. We desperately need some joy and happiness. Now, this particular way of measuring joy is one of them, and there's a second one called the Cantrell scale. And Dr. Cantrell, the psychologist, came up with this scale many years ago, and his scale is 0 to 10. 10 is as happy as you could possibly be, and 0 is as miserable as you could possibly be. And he divided it into 3 groups: people who are suffering, to people who are thriving on the top of the scale. And that is bearing out this very same research. Another source, or I believe we're continuing the same one, even as the United States economy improved after the end of the Great Recession in 2009, the report noted, happiness among adults did not rebound to the higher levels of the 1990s, continuing a slow decline ongoing since at least 2000. There are many determinants of happiness in the United States. The World Happiness Report, for instance, focuses on the role of digital media, noting that many of the activities correlated with unhappiness among young Americans, spending time on the internet, listening to music alone, using social media, happen typically on a computer or cell phone. That study also cites the opioid epidemic and the poor state of American health in general as both drivers and symptoms of American unhappiness. The United States is in the period of the longest ongoing decline in average life expectancy since World War I, fueled in large part by the rising rates of suicide and fatal drug overdoses. This despite the fact the nation is also in one of its longest economic expansions in history. This was posted in the Washington Post prior to the epidemic, the pandemic. We were already pretty miserable prior to the epidemic. And I don't know about you, that made me lonely. That made me pretty sad to have to be alone for so much time and be unable to worship together with my brothers and sisters. I enjoyed worshiping in my pajamas, okay? But that just doesn't fit with what we need. Yes? We're going to be in Philippians, the book of Philippians, in a few minutes. Right now, we're talking about the way the world is. Do you agree or disagree, John, that people are pretty sad? They are pretty sad. The world, there's a lot of people in this world who are very sad. And there's too many Christians who are pretty sad. We've got nothing to be sad about. It's too true. And we don't accept and enjoy God's forgiveness enough. Yeah? And there's plenty of people who've lived with me in my house who've been pretty miserable too. And you see some of it in your house, absolutely. You watch what goes around you, you'll see it. Absolutely. Now, what really surprises me is something called the Easterlin effect. Professor Richard Easterlin in 1974 famously noted that happiness in the United States had remained unchanged from 1946 through 1970, despite a huge rise in the gross domestic product, and that's on a per-person basis. This finding became known as the Easterlin paradox. It continued to hold true until today. Indeed, the average life evaluation in the United States as compared by the Cantrell ladder, that's the 0 to 10 scale, has declined during the past dozen years from 7.2 in 2006 to 6.9 in 2018, despite ongoing economic growth. Guess what? It didn't get better during the pandemic. We're about the same place, that 6.18 or so. We desperately need joy. Consider the article in this year's report by Professor Jean Twenge on the rapid rise of adolescent depression, suicidal ideation, and self-harm after 2010, and a marked decline in subjective well-being, apparently due in part to the astoundingly large amount of time the young people are spending on digital media, smartphones, video games, computers, and the like. It's plausible to describe a significant fraction of adolescents as addicted to screen time, and that it is certainly how many young people themselves describe it. They regard their own heavy use of smartphones and other screens as a major problem to overcome, with 54% saying they spend too much time on their devices. The numbers cited by Twenge are indeed startling. By 2017, the average 12th grader spent more than 6 hours a day of leisure time on just 3 digital media activities: using the internet, being on social media, and texting. It's crazy. We're getting sadder and sadder and sadder as we're more and more and more connected. We're getting more and more lonely as we are in a much broader and yet more meaningless web, less meaningful relationships. You tell me, how many acts of terror can you name? I know we have to start here. I created this material before we'd had ours. But we're far from the only ones, right? What else can you name? I'm the only one who can think of one? 9/11. An 11-year-old girl was shot in her home yesterday. Sadly, you can say that about almost every day, can't you? The school shootings are so terrible. In fact, we've had a recent incident of a student threatening another student with a gun, and he did it on social media. That's all. The only real redeeming thing about a junior high student, they don't understand the consequences sometimes and are willing to just tell everybody that they're about to do terrible things, and gives us a chance. Pardon me? I have seen Dr. Phil. I don't watch him regularly. That's your show? Yep. He asks a lot of questions. Yep. Does any of those people who come on Dr. Phil, are any of them really very happy? Sometimes, but you know, get to learn from it. Yeah. There you go. That's something to watch, that's for sure. Unfortunately, I hear about too many problems on it. Any other incidents you can think of? What was the incident this week in Germany? Did you hear about that one in Hamburg? Who was the victim there? Do you remember? Yeah, it was the Jehovah's Witnesses. Someone went in there, and the police were able to get them separated from some of the people, but they shot and that person shot and killed several until he killed himself up on, I think, the third floor of that building. Yeah, but we're hearing this every day. We're hearing this practically every day. How many school shootings can you name? The incidents in Mexico, somebody driving right into the middle of a firefight between two rival gangs, right? And two of them killed, two kidnapped. And one of the kidnapped individuals wounded. They just went from South Carolina to celebrate. And one of them was going to get a tummy tuck and a more inexpensive procedure. They didn't expect for that to happen. And it just did. And we're seeing that more and more and more. What indications that you have that the world is getting happier? Not too many? I mean, they're going to build a theme park, I guess, and for kids. Maybe that'll be nice. Why do we need theme parks for kids? They seem to have a good time no matter where they're at. But we parents are willing to pay for it, aren't we? What indications do you have the world is becoming a little more miserable day by day? Road rage. Now, there's a big issue, isn't there? That's right. You're afraid to. I actually, one of our, a very coarse individual who is, as he ages, he's having more and more trouble speaking in front of me without using profanity. I can tell he's having some cognitive difficulties, but he's finally said, I can't give anybody the finger anymore. I'm afraid they're going to shoot me. Well, I'm glad he's recognized that possibility. Road rage is a big issue. Are we getting more or less violent? I think more so. Constantly, we keep talking about ways to bring it down and try to work on it, but it seems to be getting worse and worse and worse, doesn't it? And we think it'll go away if we... It's not the gun, it's the shooter, it's the mentality. Now, maybe it would be wonderful if there were very few guns out there like England and Australia, but they have people who go around stabbing people randomly with knives. There's almost no way to stop this kind of misery and difficulty. And I wonder why you're a homebody. Well, you're stuck with ranting and raving me all the time, you know. But no, I understand. We've always needed joy. This is nothing new. What's the second sin we read about in the Scriptures? What does it have to do with anger? First sin was Adam and Eve. There was no violence, there was no anger there. There was some envy and jealousy of God. Yeah, I want to know what God knows. I'm going to eat that fruit. But what's the second sin? Murder. Why did Cain kill Abel? Because God did not have respect for his... Pardon me? His brother pleased God and he didn't. I'm sorry, Billy. But his brother pleased God and he didn't, and he was jealous, and instead of changing his attitude, which God told him to do. I suppose the first sin was him bringing the fruit of the ground. There was nothing said there whether the fruit of the ground was bad or not. And it is interesting that God required blood sacrifices so often in the Scriptures, but God also accepted the first fruits. God also accepted vegetable sacrifices too. But the difference, Abel brought of the first lambs, and he brought the very best he had. And Cain just brought of the fruit of the ground. There's nothing said about the quality of it. And evidently, the big problem was in Cain's heart. And that did not get better whenever God reprimanded him. Who is the most unhappy of the 12 disciples, of the 12 apostles? Judas. How does he handle his issues? He goes out and hangs himself. Peter's not a whole lot happier, but Peter wept bitterly, and Jesus is able to restore him. But for Judas, it had been better if he had never been born. And Jesus is the one who tells him that, right? Why did Judas do it? What had happened but to make up Judas's mind? The Scriptures are fairly clear about this. Although there seems to be, it's a very complicated thing, I suppose, when you let Satan enter into you to do such a terrible thing. But it was the anointing of Jesus by Mary, Martha's sister, Lazarus' sister, by breaking that alabaster ointment that was worth 300 pence, 300 denarii, 300 days' wages. And Judas is the one who begins the criticism, why wasn't this sold and given to the poor? It's worth 300 denarii. And Jesus reprimands all of them, because they're all saying it, but Judas is the one who started this by saying, the poor you have always with me. And what she's done is going to be spoken of. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. You're absolutely right, which is what Paul says to Timothy, isn't it? But Judas is a miserable individual, and what made him miserable? He's a thief. He had the money bag, and he was dipping into that money bag. If you want to talk about somebody miserable because of sin, Hosea marries Gomer at God's command and lives this life that God is already living. God is the one who has married an unfaithful wife, Israel. God's the one who is going to buy her back time and time and time again. God's the one whose wife is unfaithful to him, and her children are not his. They're children of idolatry. Gomer and Hosea were not happy people, I cannot imagine. Although there was redemption in the story, and that's the real point. How did things go in Joseph's family? Lots of jealousy. Joseph gets to go to Egypt because his brothers sold him into slavery, right? They intended to kill him, and Simeon seems to let them know, the oldest seems to tell them, let's let him die of natural causes. Here, put him in this cistern. He won't get out of there alive. And he intends to rescue him himself later on, but they come up with a better idea. Let's monetize this situation. Let's sell him to the Midianites as a slave. What are they afraid of at the end after their father has died? They're very worried that Joseph is going to kill them. And Joseph says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Joseph was amazingly forgiving, but this was not a happy family situation. And if you think the Israelites and God's people are miserable sometimes, think about the sinners. Who's the fellow who ended up hanged on his own gallows? Haman was not a happy man, was he? Haman was jealous constantly. He was ambitious, and he expected to be able to hang his enemy, and built this high gallows so everybody in town could see Mordecai hanged, and he ends up hanged on his own gallows. And that's what hatred and anger and misery will do to us. It only makes us more miserable. How many of us get hanged on our own gallows? Really? Yep. It'll get you and get you, won't it? Tell me about the first king of Israel. How did things go for him? He was a great man at the beginning. Great in stature. He's head and shoulders above all the people. And is he a godly man at the beginning? Saul the son of Kish? He prophesied. And the question was, is Saul too one of the prophets? But how does he end his life? He's throwing spears at others, and he falls on his own sword, doesn't he? He's not a happy man. He's not a happy man. And another individual I think of in this light is Ahab and Jezebel. Talk about miserable people. Miserable people. If you can't get what you want, turn your face to the wall and cry. And your wicked wife will get it for you. They died their miserable deaths because of the misery they lived in. We still need joy. We still need joy. People don't seem to understand it, but church matters more than anything else in the world, not because of this building or this organization per se, but it is where God has made known his manifold wisdom. It is the place that God has put the saved together in. Acts 2:47. God added to their number daily those who are being saved. The church is so very important. And guess what? We're not always happy in it. Sadly, we're fighting each other so often. There's too many splits that go on. There's too much infighting. It is the most important thing in the world, and we fight about other things because we think they're important. What happens when somebody dies who has a great deal of wealth and has some children? Do they always get along really well? Oh, yes, make that will and make it clear. That can be the number one problem. Money is not really very important, but the more there is of it, the more important it seems to be to us. And we'll fight about that. Salvation's more important than any of that. So it's no surprise that we're not always getting along. And in fact, Paul's command we've been talking about, Philippians 4, verse 4, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I'll say rejoice, comes right after. He asks the brethren there to help Euodia and Syntyche get along. They're both faithful Christians, and they need to be reconciled, and they need help reconciling. We're still fighting. Why is growth down? Why is attendance down in churches throughout the country? Now, there's some new churches tend to thrive. We're not starting very many new churches. And that's something we've got to change. We've got to plan on beginning new congregations, because that's where most growth takes place. But why is attendance down and growth down? What are we singing? Sing and you'll be happy today. Are we rejoicing every day? Are we getting along with one another as we ought to? Why is it down? Does it have anything to do with joy? We've got to study a lot of things over and over and over again, and we'd better be sure of the truth. But I am sometimes concerned whenever leaders announce, we've got to restudy this because we're not growing. We've got to take a second look at this particular doctrine because it's not very popular. And we think if we'll make the change to what most people think about it in the world, we'll start growing at that point. Oh, major danger. In fact, one of the most important things in church growth among all individuals, Donald McGavran was at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. And one of the things he noted, he founded the Church Growth Institute there. And one of the things he noted in common about growing churches is they had a strong theological basis. They demanded that people go back to the Bible or whatever their theology was, and they did require a difference between the world and themselves. We don't want something that does nothing for us. One of the things that frustrates me most about Walmart is that they don't offer. I find something really great there and nobody's buying much of it, and then they decide, well, we're not going to carry it anymore. I go to Walmart to buy what I need, and if it's not there, I'm liable to go to Target or something else. I end up going to the hardware store and buying the thing I had to have a particular tool yesterday to put in a faucet, and I had to go to Ace Hardware. I paid $20 for a $10 tool because I had to have that thing, and I was willing to pay the price to be able to install that sink. Well, if we don't have eternal salvation, if we're not teaching God's truth, who are we? What's the point? Restudying is so very, very, very dangerous. I think we need to restudy constantly and reprove the truth. Go back. Let's get it from the Bible. But let's not restudy because we don't like what it says. Okay? Are we still preaching the Beatitudes? Or are we preaching our bad attitudes? We need to have joy and show joy every day. What's our favorite songs? I remember a teacher who lived his life with joy. He had a grin on his face every day, and he taught us New Testament Greek. It was so hard to be mad at him. He was demanding, he was insistent, and he helped us learn Greek. He was also loving and forgiving when we got to Greek 5, and we really couldn't do what we were supposed to do. He tried and worked with us. But he did definitely teach me how to know when someone's lying to me by using the Greek language. And Brother Monroe Tharp, with his sunny disposition, ruined one of my favorite songs. He said, "Why are we singing the complainer's song? I don't like the complainer's song. Tempted and tried, we're oft made to wonder why it should be thus all the day long, while there's others living about us, never molested, though in the wrong." The song says, cheer up, my brother. I like the song. I really do like it. But for him, it was the complainer's song. And he felt like we were just whining and griping. And actually, God's answer to that is found in Jeremiah. When Jeremiah asked the very same question, why are the wicked prospering? And God asked him, are you able to run with the horses? Nope. Jeremiah was told, why are you asking that question? Trust me. Give me trust. And we've got to trust God. Life's evening sun is sinking low. A few more days. And I can't get to that note, right? I love that song. That was my grandmother's song. You know, we'd go to we were singing out of the blue songs of the church, hymnal, and lots and lots of hymns and things. But whenever we'd go down to Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, they had the majestic hymnal. And they kept singing a lot of those Stamps Baxter songs, and lots of songs about heaven. I think the average age in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, has always been at least 10 years above the national average. And they loved those songs, and I loved hearing songs like Life's Evening Sun. But are we miserable? Brethren, there's no excuse for that. Today, I'm telling you, we can't be miserable. We cannot be miserable. In fact, we won't be miserable if we're faithful to God. I want us to make a conscious effort at doing better, because rejoicing is a choice. But even as our circumstances dictate, if I'm a child of God, think about what the psalmist said in Psalm chapter 30. Sing the praises of the Lord, you his faithful people. Praise his holy name, for his anger lasts only a moment, but his favor lasts a lifetime. Weeping may stay for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning. Rejoicing comes in the morning. I'm ready for that. I'm ready for the morning. But Paul goes beyond this statement, which, when writing to Israel, why is David saying there's weeping at night? Because often Israel was unfaithful and they deserved the punishment of God. And even David will experience that whenever he decides to count God's people later in his life. And he turns himself over to God whenever Nathan the prophet gives him the choices of whether or not he would run from his enemies from a certain point of time, or would he suffer a plague, and he put himself in the hands of God. And that's why he buys that piece of ground and he makes that sacrifice, ending the plague just outside of Jerusalem, on the ground where Abraham had offered Isaac, on the ground there on Mount Moriah where Solomon is going to build the temple. Joy comes in the morning. But let's avoid the sin as much as we can. Let's live in God's grace, and let's do our utmost to obey God's command. Rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I'll say rejoice. We started with a song. Let's end that same way. Oft we fail to see the rainbow up in heaven's fair sky, when it seems the fortunes of earth frown and pass us by. There are things we know that are worth more than silver and gold. If we hope and trust him each day, we shall have pleasure untold. You gotta sing and be happy, press on to the goal. Trust him who leads you, he will keep your soul at all. Be faithful, look to him and pray. Lift your voice and praise him in song. Sing and be happy today. Next week, we're going to go through the book of Philippians looking for that word joy. I believe we're going to find it 14 times. God bless you.